Welcome back, everybody. We are working on our Taco Spinner web application where we have done all sorts of cool stuff. In the last lesson, we were able to support asynchronous content. You'll notice our the pizza button. It loads after a 3-second delay, but using global click and keyboard listeners, we are able to control the spinning of each button, even though some content may be loaded asynchronously. And that's an important addition to our web interaction components that we're building. And we're going to continue to improve these in this lesson, where our focus is going to be on taking our current code base, which is in app.js. And you'll see here we're adding event listeners, we are adding key down listeners and click listeners, and sort of doing all of our logic and functionality inside of this app.js class. But what I want to do is kind of clean this up a bit. I want to create what we could call a separation of concerns, meaning that I want to split out our code into multiple files in exportable modules that we can then use as needed. And then each file can kind of focus on just doing one thing really, really well. And I think this is an important way to structure your projects for the longevity and the ease of use whenever you're especially working in a team of developers. It's going to be just a great way to develop, and it's definitely something you should strive for whenever you're developing your own components. And in order to do this, basically what we're going to do is we are going to convert our code that is currently just running once on page load. So whenever the page loads, it's going to run document.add event listener, click, and it's just going to run once and it's done. It never runs again. We're going to kind of convert this pure JavaScript that we're just running in this app.js file to its own module, its own class that we're going to create in a separate file. And then we'll import that into this file, and we can use it to not only, create these switch interactions that we have developed thus far, but also to create multiple instances of those switches and allow us to configure each one in a different way. And this is going to be really cool. I'm going to show you why we want to do this and some advantages to this approach as we go through the lesson. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to jump over here to our JS folder on the left. I'm going to right click and click on New File, and we're going to create a file called switch.js. And let me shrink down this sidebar a bit so we have some more room to code. And inside of this switch.js file, what we're going to do is we're going to do, first of all, export class switch. And before I go forward, I know there's going to be some developers out there who are like, hold the phone, hold up. Did he just really use the class syntax? This is one of those things that makes people mad for some reason. Some people really like classes in ES6 or in ECMAScript. Some people really don't. And that is a matter of opinion. I think it's great if you feel strongly one way or another. I don't feel strongly one way or another, to be honest. I love the class syntax, but I'm fine with the advantages of the other approach too, which is called a prototype method. But basically, there's this debate about whether or not you should use classes and whether or not it's a good practice in your solutions. And I just want to mention that you don't have to use classes. You can develop this however you want. And not only that, but we are using Parcel.js as our build process. And in just about any build process, as I mentioned before, most modern JavaScript applications are going to run through a library called Babel.js, which transpiles your code in a very configurable way. So you can actually write your ES6 classes, but you can set up Babel.js to actually transform those classes into prototype methods during that build process, which I think is kind of the best of both worlds. As a developer, I only have to worry about this nice class syntax, which is very easy to write, very easy to read, in my opinion. And then when it goes through the build process, I get the best performance and the best possible scenario in terms of the runtime of our application. When it's actually running in the browser in production mode, it actually gets converted down to a prototype method. And I think there's a plugin that you have to add to your Babel.js configuration. I think it's literally called transform classes, and it will do just that. So regardless of which side of the fence you fall on, I really don't care. We're going to write classes in this case, and you could choose to configure your solution to compile down to prototype methods. You can just use classes, or you can just use prototype methods. It's totally up to you how you want to do that, but I just wanted to address that first, because I know some people are going to see me type the word class in a JavaScript file, and they're just going to freak out. And I don't want you to freak out. I want you to know it's okay. You can do whatever you want. You know, this is your rodeo. You ride that JavaScript horse however you want. And that is a colloquialism that I just made up. I think it's awesome. Anyway, so if you've never used classes in JavaScript before, basically what it is you can kind of add methods to this class. And so, for example, we could have a method for toggling the switch, or a method to initialize the component. And you can kind of do whatever you want inside of a class. It's very similar to the class syntax that's in other programming languages as well. And if you've done any development, you've probably encountered this before in one way or another. But basically what we'll do is we'll create this class called switch, and then our app.js file will import this class, and then it can instantiate multiple instances of this class. And we'll see what that looks like in just a moment. But the first thing we want to do is we want to set up a constructor. And then that constructor is basically some code that's going to run whenever we first create an instance of this class, whenever we instantiate it. And so first of all, what I want to do here is I want to initialize the component. Did I spell that right? Initialize. That's a weird word, isn't it? And then that's going to run a method that we're going to create on this class. We don't have it yet. We're going to do this.init. So that's going to be an initialize method that we create. And then we can simply return this, just in case, in code somebody wants to use the instance of the switch after we instantiate it. You can just return this, and it returns the instance of this class. And then once we've done that, we'll probably put a comment up here that says create new instance of switch, or new switch instance, I guess is a clearer way to say that. And then we'll create our initialize component method. So this will just look like this in it, and then we can put whatever code we want into here. And isn't that a nice syntax? Even if you hate JavaScript or ECMAScript classes, like just look how easy this is. I just say class switch, I put in my constructor, and then I put whatever methods I want on here. It's just easy to write, easy to create, easy to maintain and read. I really like ECMAScript classes, and I think it's the purview of the build process to figure out how to best make this work in the context of the browser. But anyway, I digress. You can do whatever you want there. But what we're going to do inside of this initialize method that we've created on this class is we're going to create our global click listener. So just like in app.js, we did document.addEventListener click. We are going to do the same thing here. So we'll say global click listener, document.addEventListener click, and then instead of adding our listener right here, instead of adding that function right here in the code, again, we're kind of refactoring this to be a little bit easier to read, a little bit easier to work with. I'm just going to pass this as a reference to a method that we're going to create on this class called switch. So we're just going to do this.switch. That will pass a reference to a switch method that we create down here. And just like you would normally do, like capture the event and then do something with the switch, we can capture the event as a parameter on this. Unfortunately, you don't get really good IntelliSense. You'll notice that E is of type any, so JavaScript doesn't really know what E is. If you want to get good IntelliSense, you can use Visual Studio Code's Jsdoc feature, which will basically, you can set a type on the E parameter. So I could call that a mouse event, for example. And we could say that is the click event that occurs. And then in the comment up here, we'll just say flip the switch, like so. And now when I hover over this parameter, I actually get mouse event. And the reason why I do that using Jsdoc is just for IntelliSense, because now I can type e.target, right? It gives me that autocomplete by using Jsdoc and assigning the parameter as a type mouse event. I can keep that nice IntelliSense that we had before. And normally in a real application, I would probably add Jsdoc comments to all of these with return values. You can do like return void for example, and that just makes your autocomplete and your hover tooltips on all your variables and methods and stuff just a lot easier to work with. But again, you can kind of choose what works best for you. And then basically inside of this switch method, let's take all this stuff, we'll cut it because we don't need this global click listener anymore. Now we're using one inside of our switch class, and we'll paste this in here. And you'll see here, we're doing the same thing we did before. We're checking to make sure we're not a spin button. If you get to this point in the code, we're going to prevent the default click. We're going to get the button using the closest traversal method, and then we're going to spin that taco. But we should probably rename this to be switch that button or whatever, because we want this to be nice and generic. We don't want it to be specific to a taco button, because in fact, we want this to be reusable in as many scenarios as possible. And you should think about that when you're picking variable names and parameter names and classes and stuff like that. Try to make it super generic, because it's going to just be easier to cognitively apply to a lot of different situations if you can sort of strive to make everything as generic as it can be. And now that we've done this, I'm going to save this class. I think that's all we need to do. We have our global click listener, and then we have our functionality down here that's doing the same thing it did before. And now that we have created this awesome exportable switch class, we can jump over into app.js, and at the top of our file here, we can import switch from switch, like so. So we're actually importing that class, which again is a class. We have to instantiate it to actually use it. So in place of where we previously had our global click listener, now we can just create an instance of our switch class that we've created. And it's going to do the same thing that it did before. So here we can just create switch buttons, const switch buttons is equal to new switch, like so. And so that's just going to run through. It's going to instantiate this, which will run the constructor, which is going to initialize the component by adding a global click listener. And then every time you click the document, it's going to run the same code that we had before. So basically, we didn't do anything different than what we had before. We basically just deleted a bunch of lines from our app.js and moved them into switch.js. But there's going to be a lot of advantages of doing this. You'll see, first of all, that hopefully, our click listener still works just as it did before. But now we've kind of moved this to a separate file. And what's cool about this is I can now use this class to do all sorts of extra things. And in particular, perhaps I want to make our switches more configurable. So again, they're a little more generic, and there's something that I could reuse in a lot of different scenarios, because that's what we want to strive for. We want to make web interaction components that you can use in a large variety of situations. And in this case, anytime you have any sort of interaction in a web application where you need to switch something on and off, this pattern or this component that we've built is going to be a good option to do that. It's not going to be specific to a spin button or a taco button or whatever we want to call it. And that means that we need to update our switch.js class to basically remove all the things that are specific to a spin button. So you'll notice we have classes here that are kind of hard-coded in right now as spin button, and we're toggling a spin class. What we can do is we can make all that stuff configurable and give them a default value, but allow, whenever you instantiate this class, for developers to override those default values. And that's not that difficult to do. So let's go ahead and add that now. What we're going to do, first of all, is in our constructor, we're going to add an options parameter. So you'll be able to pass in an options object, and then we'll add a section here that just says configure component. And the way I normally like to do this is I set this.config. So I'm basically setting on this instance of the switch class, I'm going to set a property called config that's going to equal an object that contains all of our configuration. So that object could contain the class name that is toggled, which is going to have a default value of spin. It could contain the selector, which is going to be, .spin button or something like that. Whatever options or configuration you want, you're going to have stored in this object that's a property on the instance of the class just called config. But what I actually want to do is I want to give it default options or a default configuration and then allow this options parameter to override those defaults. And there's a pretty handy method inside of JavaScript and ECMAScript called object.assign that will allow us to do that. And you'll notice in the tooltip that pops out, it says copy the values of all the properties from one or more source objects to a target object, returns the target object. And you'll see in the parameters, you have the first argument or the first parameter is a target, and then any additional parameters are sources that basically override the target. So that means what we can do is we can kind of have our default configuration in this first argument, which is just going to be an object, and then we can have options override that object. So that means that, for example, we could have a class that is toggled on and off whenever you switch. And rather than hard coding that class as spin, we'll just maybe have something, again, really generic that could apply to any switch. And maybe that could just be active. Is the switch active or not? And what's cool about that is let's just to test this, we'll do console.log this.config. So whenever we instantiate that, it'll actually log out the value of the config, and you'll see class is active whenever we log that out. But whenever we instantiate this now, if we are to add our own configuration, I could say class is, spin that we're using on here. So I'm actually overriding the default configuration of our switch component. And now when I save, and we go and we look here, you'll see that I have now updated our configuration for that instance of a switch button to use different configuration, which is pretty cool. This is a cool pattern because it allows us to you can make as many switches as you want now. And you can have one toggle a spin class and another one toggles a taco class or a burrito class or whatever you want. You can use that in as many scenarios as you can think of because we now have the ability to override the configuration. But that also means that in our switch class, we need to come down here to our actual switch method. We need to change all the places where we're using that. And in that case, that's only one location right now. We're toggling the spin class right here. And we need to replace this with this.config.class, right? That's the property that's going to contain that configuration. Now this isn't going to work. So if I do this.config.class, you would think that would work most of the time, but you'll actually notice that when we do that and we click, we're actually getting an error. It's saying cannot read property class of undefined. So it's saying, wait a second, this.config is undefined. If we come up to the top of this and we do console.log this, well, what's this whenever this switch method is actually called? Well, when we click on the button, you'll see this is actually equal to the document. And you might think, well, what the heck? We're in a class. And that's just kind of a scoping issue. Whenever we are adding this event listener and this.switch is called, in the scope of this method, because it's actually called from the click listener, this keyword is actually going to equal whatever the click listener is attached to. So in that case, it is the document itself. This keyword does not equal this instance of the switch class. But we can fix that easily enough using an arrow function. Up here in our global click listener, you'll notice if I were to capture the mouse event parameter, using this arrow function right here, I can then turn around and pass that to this.switch, and that's going to change the scope of that so that this keyword will remain a reference to the instance of the switch class, which is probably a better way to do this. So you'll now see with this console log in place when I save, and let's clear the console, we'll come over here and we'll click. You'll see it worked, first of all, and you'll see that this keyword is now equal to an instance of a switch. So you'll see there we have this.config.class, which in this instance of the switch is equal to spin. So now that we've done that, we fixed that issue. Let's go to the bottom of our switch method, and you can see there it's toggling this.config.class. We already put that in there. So let's just take that console.log out. And you'll see it's adding spin on that button. So info button spin. If I click on the next one, we're adding spin there. And now that we've done that, I want to show you another method to do the same thing. And again, you can choose whatever method you prefer. You can do this method where we actually pass the class as a configuration when we instantiate it inside of our JavaScript file. That's totally fine and a totally valid way to do this. But if you want, in a lot of cases, if you want to have the author of the HTML to kind of have control over this stuff rather than having to put it into your JavaScript file, we can use what's called a data attribute to actually pass data to our instance of the switch, to our web interaction component instance. And what I mean by that is inside of your HTML, there's kind of a standard way to create your own attributes where they're called data attributes, but you basically do data dash something equals, and then you could put in whatever you want. And we're just making this up. Like this is just a fake attribute that we're making up. But in this case, what we could do is, for example, we could say data switch, and we could say that's the attribute I want to make up in this case, and data switch equals spin. What I'm doing in this case is I'm actually saying, hey, I want this to be a data switch. So I want it to be a switch component, but I want it to toggle the spin class on and off on this button. And that's just kind of another way to do it. Like you could either have users pass the configuration of that class through the instantiation here, or you could use data attributes to pass in string values from the HTML itself. The advantage with this approach is that I could now create like another button right down here. And if I really quickly wanted to change the class that it does, like if I wanted to make this, I don't know, grow or something like that, I could just change the class right in the HTML and you're done. You're gonna have a new value that's passed into your JavaScript instance. Because we're using a data attribute to actually store that. And not only that, but another advantage is this is now I don't necessarily have to use the spin button class to select this. You can actually use your data attribute as a selector for this component. And so what that means is inside of our switch class, if we want to update that to use this, we could, instead of using .spin button in all three locations where we do that, we could do square brackets, which is an attribute selector in a query selector or a CSS selector, and we could say data switch, right? So we can actually select those buttons and see if it matches not on the spin button class, which again is going to make our component a little more reusable, but rather we can kind of hook up to this data attribute and say, well, we don't care what your class is on your switch that you're creating. We only care about the presence of a data switch attribute. And then the value of that attribute will contain the class that you actually want to switch on and off. And if we want to make this really configurable at this point, what we could do is up in our configuration, instead of passing in a class, we could configure an attribute or ATTR, and we could call that, of course, data switch by default. But now, whenever you instantiate this, you could choose whatever the attribute name is. So this is probably usually the way I would prefer. Let's take out this console log. This is usually the way I would prefer to do this sort of thing, just because it's. I find that you're going to have to update your JavaScript less because you're kind of giving control over the configuration of this to your HTML, which I generally find is a good pattern, is a good way to do it. But totally up to you. Again, you can you have all the options available to you in your developer tool belt. You can pick out whichever of those methods that you want from that tool belt and implement it into your solutions. But in this case, let's do it this way, where we're actually going to configure the attribute in the instance of the class whenever we instantiate it. And then now down in our switch method here, instead of hard coding data switch, we can change this to a template string. So I can do the backticks. And then in both of these instances where we're doing data switch, we can replace that with a template string expression. So $, and then curly brackets. And then inside of that, we'll put this.config.attr. And then that'll basically put data-switch in there, just like we had before, but now it's configurable. Now I can choose in each instance that I create from this, which attribute name I actually want to use, which is going to make this a lot more reusable. Let's do the same thing down here. I'll change this to backticks. We'll put it in an expression of this.config.attr. Like so. And then now there's no longer a this.config.class. And what we can do instead is we can simply say button.getAttribute And then we can get the attribute. You can see you just pass it an attribute name, and it's going to get us the value of that attribute. So we want to get the attribute called this.config.attr. So in that case, it's going to give us, spin in this case. The attribute value is spin. So in this case, we're going to toggle the class spin because we're getting the button's attribute value of data switch by default. So a little bit of a change to how this works, but now that we've done this, we have this attr thing that we can configure. I don't actually need to configure it in this case on our switch buttons because that's the default configuration to be data-switch. So if I save this now, you'll see data switch equals spin. When I click on this, it's going to add the spin class on and off. And what's cool about that is now in our HTML, if we wanted our burrito button to do something different, so we could do like data switch equals jiggle. We'll make that burrito jiggle. This is going to get weird real quick. But you'll notice that now when we click on the burrito button, if you watch the classes up here, it adds the jiggle class. And then we could go into our app.sas file. And I don't know if I've ever done this, but we'll make keyframes jiggle. And how do I want to do this? Let's go 0% and 100%. So both of those keyframes, we want to be transform translate x 0. So I want it to, at the beginning and the end of the animation, I want it to go back to center. And we're going to kind of move it back and forth on the x-axis. So then on the 25%, we'll do transform translate x negative 10 pixels. Well, actually, let's have it go right first. That seems to make more sense for some reason. Transform. And then at 75%, we will transform translate x negative 10 pixels. So we're not going to move it by very much, just 10 pixels. But what it's going to do is at 0%, it'll be center. At 25%, it'll be at 10 pixels to the right. At 50%, it'll be back at the center because it's moving from this keyframe to this keyframe. And then at 75%, it'll be 10 pixels to the left. And then finally at 100%, it's going to come back to the center. So this is going to move left and right, left and right, left and right. And now that we have our jiggle keyframes, we can add a new line up here that says jiggle that burrito. And when this has a class of jiggle, we're going to take our spinner in the middle and we will do animation jiggle 0.1 seconds linear infinite. So very similar to our spinner, our spin animation up here. And of course we need to do display inline block as well. Let's see if that works. All right, look at that burrito. It is a jiggling burrito. This is pretty weird. We're getting weird now, but we are using our data attributes, right? This is cool. So we're spinning some. We are jiggling the burrito and spinning some tacos. Our pizza button still doesn't work because we didn't add the data attribute to it. So we could go up here where we're creating our pizza button and we could say data switch equals spin. So maybe we want a spinning pizza. And when we save there, we get all three of our buttons working using a data attribute. And you can see just how configurable this is going to be now. Like I could come in and I could create even, like if I wanted to use a different attribute, so maybe I want to do like a whole separate thing for jiggle buttons. I have to say that's probably a first for that variable name that I've ever used. But we'll do new switch. We'll pass in some configuration and we'll change the attribute in this case to data dash jiggle, I guess. And now that we've created this, I can now come in and using that instance, I could use a different attribute on our, I don't know why you would want to do that, but just showing you can, I can use a different data attribute on the burrito button and it's still going to work, but it has a whole separate instance of the switch class in this case. So you can see here's our 2 instances of that, which are going to allow us to, you can imagine as you get more complex web interactions, this is going to be really useful because you can have 2 instances of the same web interaction component, but they have totally different functionality. They're using different classes, different attributes, but they're kind of running through the same class syntax. So it's going to be nice and concise and easy to maintain from a development perspective. But in terms of implementation and presentation, you can have that same class vary greatly in its functionality across multiple different component instances, which is why we do this. This is why I like this pattern because it's so configurable. It's it ends up being less code. You can see how much code we had before, and we replaced it with just a couple lines in our app.js file, and we're kind of hiding all that functionality, all that stuff behind the scenes in this switch class right here. All right, so this is looking pretty awesome at this point. The last thing I want to do before we wrap this up is let's also move our keydown listener into here and test that just to make sure that works as well. So what we will do is we will, when we're initializing this, we will also add a global keydown listener, and we'll say document.add event listener keydown, and we'll use the same method we used up here where we capture the keyboard event argument that is fired by that listener, and we'll pass that to a custom method we'll create called this.key. And the key method we will of course have to create. So let's go down to the bottom here, and we will create key, which will take an E parameter. And again, I'm going to use the Jsdoc thing. Just type in /** and hit tab, and it'll sort of expand out there. But now we can specify this is a keyboard event. Oh, it's not a capital B, keyboard event like so. Key down event. And then if we go up here, we'll say keyboard listener like so. And then within here, we'll basically do the same thing we did before, right? We'll just have to replace it to use the new attribute thing. So let's go ahead and cut this. We can delete this old keyboard listener from our app.js file. And look how beautiful app.js is getting now. This is why we do this, right? Because when you're saying, hey, how does my application work? You only have to look at this. You only need to dive into Switch if you need to change that specific functionality. Again, that's that separation of concerns that I mentioned. But anyway, so let's go ahead and save this. We'll come back here and we will paste this in here. Let me tab that over. And we are checking that e.target matches. So let me actually copy this template string up here because we're now matching on an attribute selector. So we're going to check to make sure that the keyboard focused target is a data-switch element. And if you press the T key, we're going to prevent default, we're going to get the button, and then we're going to programmatically invoke a click. So we're going to say switch that button down here because I don't want that to be specific to a taco. And let me add a return just like we did up above. Just for consistency, we'll add that. And let's just make sure that works. If I change my keyboard focus and press the T key, sure enough, that's still going to work on all of our buttons here. Great. Our Switch web interaction component is working pretty great at this point. We've created that separation of concerns. We moved all the code to a separate module that we're importing into our app.js file, and it's working really great at this point. It's nice and configurable, and we're going to use this same pattern to build the rest of the web interaction components that we do throughout the rest of the course. We're going to create a separate component class, if you will. We're going to put all the configuration and all the methods for that functionality into that class, and then we will just instantiate an instance of that class in our app.js to actually implement it into our application. And in that instance, we can do configuration and do all kinds of cool stuff to it. It's going to make it really easy to add some new, more complex functionality to our app as it increases in capability. So stay tuned. We're going to do a lot more stuff with this. It's going to get really cool in future videos as we start to build out some of that awesome new functionality.